co-production, one of the things that's so exciting about co-production as an experience is that it's happening and burgeoning it up in all sorts of different areas, and lots of different disciplines are taking this on and taking it forward. So it's something which is, it's quite an exciting time, particularly I think in terms for people who are interested in research, particularly across fields and across disciplines. That's where some of the most sort of cutting edge and interesting, exciting stuff is happening. From my perspective, obviously I'm health and social care, and that's what I'm going to focus on, but I do recognize that there's some amazing stuff going on. So as you can see, everybody is publishing and talking about co-production right now, but it has been around for a long while. For people who haven't come across it before, it's a way of working that involves people who use a service, working with people who provide a service in a type of partnership, and an equal partnership as well, which engages people at the earliest stage of design and development and evaluation. So it has that expectation of sharedness. And I think it has some really strong values embedded all the way through it as well. And that's something that I want to look at today, particularly in terms of what does that mean for us as people working in this field, but also acknowledging that expertise comes in many different forms. So you can have book learning for sure, but experiential learning is vital. You can't provide a good service or you can't investigate or understand an issue without understanding the perspective of the people who live it. So really important to acknowledge right at the start the co-production aspect of this. So I have two colleagues, Tina Coltham and Dr. Sarah Carr, who have really informed my thinking on this and worked with me very closely in terms of how I think about this and how I do my job, really. What else did I want to say before? Person-centered perspective, I think, is something we need to really be clear that we're going to focus on today again, but also be aware as well that co-production is being owned and ripped up and reimagined by lots of different people and lots of different forces, not just service user communities. And that's something to be aware of too, because in that sort of regeneration of the idea is strength, but there are also some issues which we're going to look at as well. So with things around citizen involvement, participation, engagement, consultant, with agendas around self-care coming through and health coaching, all those things are starting to make an already complex issue a little bit more complicated than it was to begin with. So we're looking a little bit at where this idea came from. So in terms of co-production, nobody knows for sure where it started, because it's an idea that, and a concept that builds and builds and builds. But I think early, really important work being done by Eleanor Almstrom at Indiana University in the 70s, really describing that lack of recognition of service users and service delivery. Then you've got the work by Edgar Kahn, who's a civil rights law professor. So again, more ingredients into the mix. So his work on the core economy, time banking, really laying forward that interest, I think, in people understanding that creating services, creating knowledge, all that stuff is really embedded in the communities that it serves. And that's something which I think, when you're looking at kind of top-down generation of understanding and generation of knowledge and generation of services, is very much missed out. And when you come at it from the top down, you get these very bizarre things where people suggest that a service which is created to serve a person, that person doesn't fit in the service. And you're like, how do we get to a situation where we find a vulnerable person and then complain that they don't fit in our service when our service is intended to serve that person? You know, they are the end consumer. You wouldn't have someone sell you a fridge that didn't work for you at all and then have the blame put on you. So there's something to be said about, you know, how we look at the power dynamics in something like this. So recognizing reciprocity, recognizing sort of humanity of people as assets, but also as not as economic units by themselves, but actually as a unit of meaning. So really important, I think, to have that understanding that what we're trying to do is actually has a communal aspect to it, but also has an ethical aspect to it as well. So this idea that everybody builds and contributes to society in different ways, that work can be valued in different ways. Obviously, cash isn't everything. It's important, particularly if you don't have any budget, but it's not everything. So if you want to have an organized, just democracy, you also need to have participation. Reciprocity is something which not only has an importance in itself, but also an importance in the fact that it creates a better quality of life for people. And again, it takes you back round to that idea again of social capital. So when you do have social capital, you're looking at something which builds a social as well as a physical infrastructure. Oh. Again, you don't worry if you can't read the slide. It's just showing you, making the point that co-production is everywhere, and everyone has said it's absolutely about to be the only thing that matters, but that's been going on for years. You know, this idea that from the 80s, you know, Anna Coote at the King's Fund introducing co-production as a way of understanding the relationship between clinicians and patients, that need for cost-effective services, but also there's real societal changes. You know, we're seeing like knowledge being democratized. So the way that the internet exists, the way that knowledge is created and presented, who owns meaning, who controls what is considered to be a good outcome, a good output. So you've got a lot of different movements in society happening at the same time. And it has been really an interesting thing to see. And another thing I think to really note as well is the importance of co-design. So there's been a story in the papers recently, well, I say in the papers, online recently, I don't know if anyone's seen it, about the tram system in one of our northern towns, I want to say Huddersfield or something like that, being redesigned by the people that use it. And it looks quite different because it's very different to organise a transport system from the perspective of someone who wants to deliver it than someone who wants to sit on it. And there's been some really interesting findings happening in terms of safety and security, particularly around it, women feeling safe in public spaces, that I don't think if it had been a team of sort of male designers separate to that, organising that output in a very separate and isolated way, I don't think you'd have had such a broad perspective on what's needed to make that a better service. But I think as well, there is something which can be a little bit utopian as well in co-production, particularly if you're striving really hard to do the best kind of work you can in a co-productive way. And I think that's something that I really want to sort of bring to your attention as well. So can people put themselves on mute if they've got an opportunity to do that? Because I can hear somebody in my ear. I just want to get you a glass of water. So there's something around this understanding. So this is taken from a document talking about the values that are inherent in you need to have already before you co-produce. So we would love to be in a world where everybody is open, honest, communicating in plain English, everyone is respected. And those things are a basic expectation, but they're also in many places an ambition still, shall we say, rather than necessarily here, present, and with us right this second. So I think it's something to bear in mind. And I would say when people say you must have these things in order to progress, you must strive for these things. These things maybe happen whilst you start insisting on them. They don't just fly out of the sky sometimes in organizations. And I wouldn't wait to do work until the time is right. I would start doing the work and then take the work to a place that appreciates you if you're not in a position to be able to enjoy these experiences. Another thing I would say with this hunger for co-production and co-everything, Williams, I've got a fantastic article that's come out, it's in the reference list, don't worry, called and it's talking about some of the shadow side, some of the darker aspects of co-production, and they're talking about cubiquity. So this idea that there's this huge appetite for participatory research practice. Everybody wants to have, you know, they want their randomized control trial, so they get the kudos academically, but they also want a nice fluffy bit on the side, like a little bit of a focus group, a little bit of a service user led thing, so that they can show that they are relevant. And to get funding, often you need to have participation of some kind. And I think it's led for a bit of a scramble where people have been using all sorts of different words to mean co-production to mean all different kinds of things that it actually doesn't. So we will also look at this kind of conflation of meanings and practices that from different collaborative traditions, all of which are valuable in their own right. Not everything has to be co-production. Co-production is important, it's exciting, but it's not a gold standard. It doesn't take away every other different kind of participation. It's one of the ways that you can have impact that's broader, an impact that's shared, but it's not the only one. So we've talked a little bit about those core values. We've talked a little bit about the different types of knowledge and who controls that knowledge, and how we look at professionalism and who gets to say what's valuable. We've also looked a little bit at kind of the social and cultural and political change that's leading to this increased interest in sort of citizen engagement, public participation, and particularly, I think, this understanding that if you want a system to run well, you need to understand the emotional experience of it. It's not just about the kind of numbers and the kind of pragmatic side of it. You actually have to understand how it feels to work, live, and be treated within that system. So these are very much more kind of relationship building kind of experiences. And I think for researchers who maybe aren't used to that way of working, it can feel extremely challenging to work co-productively. And I don't think we always take that into account when we're looking at bringing together a team or facilitating a team to come together to talk about how to work co-productively. Because I think we sometimes have kind of theatre of scientism, this idea about putting on a white coat, making your research look really clean, pristine, making it look like no human hand has touched it, and that's how you can tell it has value. And there are some types of research which need to be that way. But I think it's really important not to shoehorn co-production into that, because it leads to a very unsatisfactory experience for participants in the research, people who are co-creating that knowledge. But also, I think it makes the researchers feel very uncomfortable as well. So there was somebody who wrote saying, if co-production feels like it's going really smoothly and going really well and going to plan, then you're not doing it right, which I have to say I found very comforting in my work, because when it hasn't gone smoothly, when it hasn't gone easily, that's when it's been most interesting. So moving on. What can be co-produced? So everything, basically. There is nothing that you can't co-produce. Anything at all, services, policy, research, training, conferences, you name it, you can have co-productive elements, or you can co-produce them. So you have that intrinsic value, the value that people get through improved outcomes, also through their own experiences that they grow and develop as being part of a co-produced project. But also you've got this idea about increasing capacity in terms of public services as well, and creating capacity by bringing people's lived experience, time and resources. So that could be through peer-led networks. It could be through having working with a broad volunteer base, using time banks. All those sorts of things can happen. And your project doesn't have to look like anybody else's. And one way I would say, particularly if you're working, as I do often, with people who have mental health issues, one of the things I do in terms of co-production is I break down the tasks so that I make them quite small, so that you can pick as many of the tasks that you want to be part of as possible. So I've recently been working with women's organisations looking at their access to GPs. And if I ask someone to sign up for the whole of the research project, it would put people under tremendous pressure. That they might not be able to complete the whole thing, that a lot of the people I'm working with are at home with kids right now, that you've got the COVID stuff, you've got all that stuff going on as well. But if you say there is a steering group who meet virtually and they do this, there is another group who do this, then people can pick and choose what they want to be part of, what they feel works for them. If they can only work remotely, they can do one thing. If they can only work at certain times, or they want to review documents, they can do that. So there's something around, I think, chunking up the jobs so that people can participate and co-produce what they be part of it in the way that they want to, rather than the way that we think that you have to. So that's one of the jobs I would say. The things that really stand out, that are the most challenging, is this to do with, not to. And that is a real, you only realize you're doing it once you've done it. So I think it's really important to when you're getting together in a team to work co-productively, is to recognize, already build in, when we make mistakes, what will we do? Because there's often moments where we work in the ways that we're used to working, where we work in the ways that we have expectations in the past of working. I was running a focus group once when I was working with some people, and I asked them a question about health and sort of relating to others. And they said, oh, I don't know the answer to that, but I know someone who does. And immediately one of the focus group called their friend to ask them. So it's a classic kind of phone a friend. And it was really interesting because I'd never thought to mention, obviously, when we're in the focus group, don't call anyone else. And the experience became even more complicated when about 10 minutes later, the person who'd been called actually turned up to the focus group with their bags, their shopping bags, to come and help us. And so we had to think again about how we were going to manage that. But I'd gone to a group of citizens and I'd said, I want help understanding this problem. They'd come forward on their terms, we'd worked something out, and then they utilised all their resources to do that. All their resources included everyone they knew. And so we had to think again about how we manage the research protocol for things like that. I've also had situations where I've worked with different communities who are much more flattened in terms of their expectations of hierarchy. And when I've said I would like 6 to 8 people in a focus group, they've said, okay. And I've come in and found 6 to 8 people sat around, and then a ring of 20 people who've come to watch. And so there's all these sorts of expectations that maybe if you're not used to working, very openly with different types of community, with people with different types of expectation, you don't always expect. I've also had people, I've been sort of working and interviewing and having groups where people have like nudged me, and I thought, oh, I've missed a point. I turn around to encourage someone to join the conversation. I've been offered like a bowl of chips coming past. So there is something around like the way that people conceptualize helping is something that you need to be able to be quite broad-minded about. So if that's not something that's happened to you before, co-production will push you. So everybody has seen Arnstein's ladder, this idea that co-production sits within a spectrum of participation levels, from exclusion right to citizen controlled. It's really important to say that this is a concept, it's not a reality. So when you're talking about passive recipients of service, often passive isn't the word for it. Often people fight like absolute heroes to get the service that they want. They are not passive. If somebody's not speaking to you, it doesn't mean that they don't care. It might mean that they don't want to speak to you. And we have a lot of stuff around hard to reach organizations. So, and you see this often said about sort of young men from BAME backgrounds, people of color, people who are poorer, people who are homeless, people who have issues like dementia. They're hard to reach. They're not hard to reach. They're hard for you to reach. So there's something around how we sort out the kind of hierarchies that we work with and actually see them for what they are. There are ways, there's been some amazing work done co-productively with people who are living with dementia. So some of it is working with them and their carers at the same time. Some of it is working with people at the start of their diagnosis and using kind of almost like advanced planning on how we're going to work and when we're going to stop being part of that person's life in a research way. There's loads of different things that you can do. One of the things that you can't do is just say that people who aren't fitting into sort of traditional classic research strategies aren't interested or don't have anything to say, because it's not true. So it takes you around to power as well. And power is a very uncomfortable thing, I think. And it's something which dogs mental health. So anyone who's working in healthcare, you have to at some point face the fact that mental health can be the bad guy or has been the bad guy and has a legacy that it has to deal with. And I think that's true of a lot of people who are working co-productively and then trying to reach out. So if even things like, I've spoken to sort of service users and participants saying that they've been interviewed by someone who has loads of books behind them on a shelf and they felt really intimidated. So obviously that's a different kind of power, but it is something just to be aware of, how we look to other people when we're interviewing, how we look to other people when we speak in ways and use language they don't understand, how we make assumptions maybe that they're not going to understand when actually it's pretty apparent to them what's going on. And there's something I think to be said a lot about facing ourselves and the way that we handle information. I've seen certainly research that looks more like a mugging than an educational exercise to gather knowledge in a shared way. So there is something to be said as well, I think, about how we manage that dynamic, how we manage that relationship. And talking of kind of old and new power is looking remarkably like old power a lot of the time now. So when we first started off and people were talking about, makers can contact people directly, Etsy, we talk about Airbnb, we talk about Facebook, we talk about all those things that were supposed to take away the old power structures. They're bringing different issues, the power issues and the power lack of power and control. They haven't gone away. They look different now. They're fluffier in some ways and more personalized, but they're not necessarily different. So dynamic and relational, and it's something that shapes the way that we communicate, and it's okay as long as we talk about it. It's when that stuff is not acknowledged that you start to see all kinds of issues in terms of co-production. So this is just briefly looking at these kind of like expectations of difference in society now, how we're moving from some of the things which are professional specialization on one side, and then this idea about kind of radical transparency, open source sharing, A smart organisation combines the best of both. They're not, I don't think, truly opposites. You know, this idea that you can be honest and clear with people, I don't think belongs to the new world, and the old world is full of terrible people who hoard their understanding. I don't think that's the case. But also you see some amazing work being done by really big organizations using crowdsourcing. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for actually blending this stuff and not separating it out. When you're working, the things that need to happen. The first thing is, when I first started doing co-production, I can remember going to people and I was working with them and I was very proudly co-producing, and they said, you're not co-producing because we never asked you to do this. It's not co-production. It's service user involvement, but it's not co-production if it's not initiated by the person who's actually receiving that. So again, we've said co-production is a complex term. Lots of people say they own it. Lots of people say they own its history, and that's not necessarily the case. It's something that's evolving constantly. But I think there are some things which you can do in any project that will make it easier. So the first thing I think is to prioritize the service user or participants' interests. That is key. The next stuff is support them, and this can be so complicated. So particularly if you're working with somebody on benefits, you know, as professionals expect to be paid. You know, very few professionals work pro bono. Some do, which is a beautiful thing, but there is an expectation that knowledge is valued and acknowledged. That doesn't always happen. And I think sometimes the systems we work in make it really difficult to financially remunerate people, to be able to support them in people with a steady internet connection, and people with the ability to participate online, which we know is a very specific set of people. It's not everybody. And it's causing those kinds of challenges. On the other hand, it can really open up. If you've got the ability to even have sort of phone contact or even work through local libraries and things like that when they're open, you can suddenly get a lot more participation from people who thought that they had to travel to you to be part of a project or to be part of research. So there's something to be said, I think, as well about how you contact people, how you find them, and how you support them to refer back to you and to stay in touch. Another thing I think that people don't always think about is we know how long research takes. From the minute you start thinking about it, to the fight to get through ethics, to the next hurdle to look at collating your data, writing it up, to getting it published. That thing is a never-ending series of hurdles. To the dreaded second peer reviewer who always sends it back. There's a real long-term, long haul with research that sometimes citizens who are participating have no clue how long this is going to take. They think it's a problem-solving exercise. And I think that's something that we can often need to be really, really clear about. So, I mean, I've sat in sessions where someone says, oh, if you tell this lady what's wrong, then she'll tell the government and the government will fix it. And I'm like, that's not what this is. And there are also situations as well when maybe if you're working for a statutory body or something like that, where people almost try and use it as a therapeutic experience, which you have to be very wary of as well. If you're not qualified to do that, and if you're trying to do something else, you need to be really clear about the boundaries of what you can and can't help people to create, because it's something that you can get dragged into quite easily, and it's not particularly safe to do that. Talking of discretionary funds, it's very difficult to be able to pay people without upsetting the apple cart in terms of benefits, if that's a situation for them. It is something that can be done and can be managed, but you need to make sure that you stay within your HR expectations. For anyone going to prison for like giving someone vouchers or, but there are things that you can do. So when I've worked with community organisations, often you can make a donation to something rather than to individualise or personalise payment. On the other hand, you know, that's something that you need to negotiate with participants, because again, it's about respect, isn't it? It's about acknowledging lived experience. If someone has been unwell for 20 years and they bring 20 years worth of knowledge to your study, then it's really important that you acknowledge that in the way that they've asked for. Stuff around unhelpful language, and unhelpful language is basically anything that starts to create a boundary between you and the other person and the thing that they need to understand. It can be that sometimes we use professional language. I've been in meetings where people have said, I thought this person was an expert. I'm like, they're an expert in their experience. They're not an expert in research. And if we're using the kind of language and we're publishing in ways that people who are participating can't understand, I think you have to wonder sometimes who we're publishing for and who we're writing for and who we're talking to. So in terms of language, I would say it's really useful to have 2 or 3 strands. So if you're looking to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, that's one thing. But I think always have an easy read guide as well, not at least because it helps you clarify your own ideas, and it also helps out students quite a lot, I have to say. Being a lecturer, there's something to be said about having that real clarity. If you can explain a complex idea in a clear and organized way, use infographics, use whatever it is, not only do you have a product then that people can understand and they can find their way into, but you also have something that you can share much more effectively. So if you're telling everyone about the amazing project you've done and there isn't a video to go with it, there isn't talking heads, people describing it, there isn't an infographic that's easy to tweet out or to put on Instagram, you're going to struggle. There's a fantastic, I've got 2 or 3 examples I think that are really fantastic that are on my Twitter that I can send on to you if you want, that are excellent in terms of showing how people have come together to create something. There's one on young people who've co-created their understanding of what it's like to live in South London as it gentrifies and sort of slowly pushes them out. And they've done a zine, a magazine, like an online art project. It's got lots of data embedded into it, but it's an absolutely thing of beauty and a pleasure to read. And it's very rare, I think, that you chug your way through a research project and you think, oh, I won't forget that. I'll never forget that piece of work. It was amazing. So there's something around language and communication and contacting. Having a consumer steering group or a participant steering group, and make sure your initiative actually has a majority of service users. You often see people talking about a project being co-produced when there's one person on their own trying to represent everybody, which is not fair. It's not fair. And also, it's not real. Not one person doesn't have that connection for everybody. Again, I was saying, make sure that you're ready to make mistakes and don't be afraid. When you do things that don't work, apologize. And I think that's another thing about having that power differential. If you have a power differential, coming down from your mountain to apologize or to explain is really difficult. If you are sharing this experience together and you don't have those egos involved, it makes it a lot easier. I don't know if any of you guys know Phil Barker, who wrote the tidal model. He said something that always sticks with me, and it's professionalism and humility live at different ends of the street. So I think you have to decide which end of the street you want to be at sometimes, and make sometimes a rather uncomfortable walk. So talk about power and acknowledge that experience. And just from my work, looking at, I do a lot of co-production on my curriculum in communities. Things that really stand out for me, particularly with a mental health co-production, is how challenging it is. And not challenging because people who I work with don't know what they're doing. They absolutely know, but challenging because it requires me to think about myself as a practitioner, as a nurse. It requires me to think about myself as a researcher and a teacher and a communicator. It requires me to think about the kind of processes and power at an organizational level. And they're not always comfortable thoughts. You know, everybody wants to be, no one wants to be the bad guy. But sometimes when you look at things, you can see that actually our legacy isn't great. So anyone who's looking at that from Mad Lib and feeling a bit uncomfortable about the language, and that's something we have to come across, something we have to get over. We have to regain trust that we lose on a daily basis sometimes. And if you want someone to be participating with you, you have to acknowledge the strength in those people. The reason that that's not okay anymore is because those people did something about it, not because my profession did anything about it. And there are things that are better now, but it's not. It was a hard-won fight, and I think you have to put the recognition where it's due. So we've got the history, the fact that co-production takes time. It takes time to have those relationships with people. It takes time and to put aside to think about how we explore power at an individual level, to make sure that we're distributing out, make sure that we're sharing choices. And it can feel uncomfortable. It can feel different. It can feel difficult and challenging. So as well, when you're looking at pressure to produce something. You've got resource constraints, you've got a drive for like rapid progress, and people want an outcome by a certain time. That can be a real challenge too. And there's certain situations that co-production isn't your best option. So if you have a predefined target, if what you're being asked to do is actually in conflict with what consumers see or the participants see as important, to do co-production to that is just going to be painful. It's not going to work. So, you know, if something's time critical or highly confidential, it's something that maybe you need to think about having elements of, but not trying to, you know, hybridize co-production discourse. You know, this idea that you just put co in front of whatever it is you want to do and pretend that somehow you're creating co-production. That's not the case. It's really important to have that honesty. So Oliver et al. Write fantastic stuff about the ubiquity, that idea about using that language of radical power sharing, basically to shoehorn in sort of entrepreneurial government expectations, you know, just putting co in front of it. That isn't co-production, and it will make people lose trust in you. So there is this huge appetite for participatory research practice. There is this real emphasis on partnership working, and those things are great. They're brilliant, but they need to be real. Otherwise, you've just got co-words and you don't really have any real co-production itself. So I'm nearly there, guys. Well done. Bearing with me. We've got seven steps. So this comes from 4PI standards, which I'm going to come to in a second. You may have to have some really uncomfortable conversations about what you can and can't do. It may be that you want to be co-producing, but actually you're going to be doing participatory research instead, or participatory project work. Just as long as you say the truth of what it is, and nobody comes in to the project believing that they're going to be achieving here when they're going to be achieving something different, that's fair enough. It's better to be honest and clear about what you can do than do a half-hearted or dishonest piece of work. But when you do have that willingness to move forward, and you do have that way of working, you can produce work and partnerships. You can have that something really valuable that comes from that power sharing, and you really will have a very different perspective. So I'll just show you another thing now. So you may have come across this work by Ensign, looking at the 4 Ps. So I've got the improvement standards there, and these are still, I think, the best and easiest way to think about co-producing work, because this was led by service user organizations. So if you're looking at how to bring this forward, I think this is the best option you have in terms of working. And also I want to finish by showing you what can be achieved with that amazing piece of work. So if you use these sorts of things, this is what you can get. So dignity and respect is about leadership, and this comes from Keeping Control study. And the Keeping Control study was a groundbreaker in so many ways for us. Whenever you think about the way that the media and society will visualize or think about people with mental health difficulties, you'll often see that they are stigmatized as violent, aggressive, that there are things that are said about them in terms of invoking fear. If you look at them as, you know, Halloween costumes that draw on mental health tropes and stigmatizing tropes, they're out there. And actually what this group did was they turned it around, and they actually said, what is the truth of violence and people who experience mental distress? And the truth is they are victimized very frequently. They are victimized because of their disability, that society sees them in a way completely differently than they do to other people who have disabilities or health impacts on their lives. And also when they do come forward for help and support, not only are they often taught not to do that, but they're also then seen as unreliable witnesses to their own experiences, which is an incredibly dehumanizing and a huge failure for these members of this community who are citizens. So I think when you look at what happens when you give people the opportunity to explore something that's important to them, they'll come back to you with something that's new, something that's fresh, something that's a different perspective, and something that's led by service users. And I think you can see here that there are professionals in there. So Trish is a social worker, I think Claudia is too, and they've got a couple of researchers there, but the main people at the front are all service users, people with lived experience. And you've got professionals on tap not on top, which is what you need. And they're asking a question that's not been prioritized by others, but has really changed the way that we think about how we visualize this subject. So here you are with the bits and bobs. So Oliver et al. I would recommend for the dark side of co-production if you're looking for something like that. But there's also opportunities to look at, maybe looking at randomized control trials, which is not my specialty, but it is, I think, something that we can do and we can do differently. So I appreciate I've whipped through that. So apologies for anyone who's got whiplash, but I've very much enjoyed speaking with you on that.